Hello, everyone. My name is Marc Sabatella, and welcome to the MuseScore Café for today, July 15th, 2020. And this is, as I said, the MuseScore Café. It's my regular weekly series of chats where I talk about some aspect of making music with MuseScore. And as always, the first thing I do is make sure that I am really live because, that's still something I need to always check on. Looks like I am. Yay. And am I hearing myself? I will need to check that too. Because I, as usual, didn't check the right box here. I'm going to assume, though, that you actually can hear. Yes, beautiful. Okay, cool. All right. So the topic that I'm picked to talk about today, and I'm often just going by whatever the last thing is that was on my mind when I picked a topic, and happen to be having a discussion on the MuseScore forum about writing guitar music and some of the specific issues that come up there. And so I figured that would make a nice topic. So anyhow, that is the plan here. We're going to talk about guitar music. And so I have a number of things that I don't know, I like to be able to do when I talk about this. And one of them is, first of all, I'm going to show you some of the things that I think are of interest when writing for guitar, whether we're talking about classical guitar. So we're looking at a classical guitar group on musescore.com right now. And I definitely want to emphasize that I'm not necessarily talking about classical guitar. I could just as easily be talking about writing rock music or writing jazz or writing anything else. But some of the things, if you're going to actually notate music for guitar, or if you're actually thinking about, well, what's playable on guitar? And so I'm talking about both fully notated music, but I'm also talking about, just writing chord symbols and writing rhythms and things like that, all the different things that come up writing for guitar. There's a ton to talk about, so I'll talk about whatever comes up. So the first thing I wanted to point out was that this classical guitar group exists, and I'm going to post it into the chat. Let's go on musescore.com. Boom, there we go. So there's the link to the classical guitar group. And it's just nice because a lot of people are members of this group. You can see there's over 1,000, and there's quite a bit of sheet music here uploaded by members. Some of it is original music by the people there who are members, and some of it is either their arrangements or their just direct, straight up transcriptions, I guess I would say, of published music. And so I just sort of grabbed one. I don't know, semi at random, but because it looked like it would maybe make a good example. And the one that I am looking at right here is this guy here, this Etude number 18 from Carcassi, and I'm just gonna post that into the chat also, so that y'all can see. Wrong one. How about this guy? There we go. Anyhow, if you can, as always, while you're on musescore.com, you can just press play to hear the thing. Let me make sure my speaker is where I want it. It is. So if I just press the space bar to play. So anyhow, that's the piece. And as classical guitar pieces go, this seems typical enough. It's not overly complex, not overly simplistic either. So it's going to be a pretty good example for me to just go through some of the things that happen. So one of the things that's going on here is you see we have multiple voices. And this is, of all the frequently asked questions on musescore.com, by far the most frequently asked question is some form of how do I do multiple voices in MuseScore? Except the problem is no one knows what to call it. If people knew to call it multiple voices, they would know where to look up the information. But people don't necessarily know that. So what it is we have this situation where we have a half note, or dotted half note in this case, but also eighth notes happening at the same time. So if you're not aware of multiple voices, you won't be able to figure that one out. So let me quickly show you how to do that. What you would do is you would enter the top voice first normally. That's by default. So these are the voice buttons over here. And let's see. Looks like I am in a workspace that I'm just going to go to the advanced workspace here. I had removed some buttons from my own custom workspace to save space. Like I don't need these double, triple, quadruple dots, so I had removed them personally. But looks like they crept back while I was doing some testing. Anyhow, voice 1 is the default voice, and normally when you enter notes into voice 1, you'll see the stem directions are kind of automatic. It changes stem direction as you enter the note. Well, that's all well and good, but if you want to have a whole note happening at the same time as those notes, I'm going to switch to voice 2 by pressing the voice 2 button. And you can see in the little pop-up there, Control-Alt-2 is the shortcut to switch to voice 2. So I will switch to voice 2 with Control-Alt-2 because I like shortcuts. And it's kind of nice because then the shortcut shows up on the bottom of the screen. Now watch what happens when I enter a whole note. I will select whole note, which shortcut is 7. If I press 7, it does the same thing. And then I can type a note, say, we'll make it A. Well, now look what happened. I now have that A here, and I have the quarter notes at the same time. And the quarter notes all flipped their stems to be up. That's kind of the norm here, is that if one note sustains and then other notes change, whenever you have multiple voices, basically, multiple independent rhythms on the same staff, normally you would have the stems down for the lower notes and the stems up for the upper notes. And you wouldn't very often do what I have here, where one of the upper notes actually crosses below the lower voice. That happens. So that's all a musical discussion. Now, the first thing I see here is that this particular user has chosen to override this. If I go to the inspector here, you'll see, oh, that's curious. That's because these are beams. They have explicitly set, when I click the beam, you can see they've explicitly set it to be down. If I hit the reset button, you'll see it goes up. And I guess the reason they did that was just to save a little vertical space. That's a personal choice. I'm not sure I agree with the use of it here. But when I look at it, most of this piece is not above the staff, right? Most of the notes are kind of on the staff, as would be expected. These are some pretty high notes. And realistically, they've let the default up stems be the case everywhere else, auto, see? And so they're up. So they've only flipped a few of them down. They flipped that first measure down, and I think I saw another measure over here, right? Where they flipped, oh no, there's only one voice here, right? There's not a second voice here. That's why these stems are down. Only when you have multiple voices do the stems start flipping to point in opposite directions. So multiple voices are a thing where if you write for piano or guitar, or if you're writing choral music, soprano, alto, tenor, bass on 2 staves, you're going to encounter multiple voices all the time. A lot of people, though, maybe aren't that familiar with it. If you play other instruments or write mostly for other instruments, you might not be as familiar with the idea of putting multiple voices on a single staff. So that always deserves a little discussion. Give me one sec. Multiple voices. Yes, okay. So one of the things that is new in MuseScore 3.5, which still hasn't released yet. You've seen me talk about 3.5. I did a whole thing on the alpha and then the beta. We are probably going to have a release candidate, meaning we think this is what we're going to release within the next couple of days, I think. And or less even. And then the actual release will be as soon thereafter as it takes for us to feel confident that we don't have any major bugs. But we think we've got it pretty good. Anyhow, one of the new features in MuseScore 3.5 has to do with multiple voices. And the best way I can show you this is I'm going to select these couple measures here. Notice that there's notes and rests here. I'm going to press Control R to reset those rests. So you can see, because someone, I could tell that they had fiddled with the position of those rests, because normally they would all kind of be aligned. Let's see, yeah, they had made these two rests here be higher than those two rests there, and that's all fine. That's a valid decision to do. But by selecting these measures and then resetting all my positions, you can see that these rests are all in the same position here. And what always used to be the case is that those rests would, we pick a default position for these rests that's low, so that it is likely to avoid notes above, but it wasn't guaranteed to. And so in previous versions of MuseScore, if you then started to move this note down, it would collide with that rest. But as you can see, this is no longer the case. We are now automatically positioning those rests. So that's actually one of the really nice new things that you have, you can look forward to in MuseScore 3.5. So that's what's going on here. One of the other things that I would want to show is, okay, we have, well, while I'm talking about multiple voices, I have to talk about this measure here. What's happening in this measure here? What happens is you have eighth notes in one voice. Boom, or whatever. Boom, 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 boom. That's the line. Okay. Boom, boom. So this leap from the G sharp to the B sharp, the G sharp here is really an eighth note, but it's shared between the voices. In other words, the G sharp in voice 1 is just an eighth note, but there's also a G sharp in voice 2 that is a dotted half note. So if I actually reset everything in here, I guess I have to do more than just Control R. Control R resets a lot of things, but not necessarily everything. So I'm going to come back here and I see it's visible. So this is what it looked like kind of originally. We had an eighth note and a dotted half note in the same voice. In many situations, this is correct. If you have different rhythms, even if they have the same note, you want to show it so that it's obvious that, oh, this note belongs to both voices. But this specific situation happens very often in guitar music, where there's basically a bass note that's a dotted half or a whole note or some long note, and then there's eighth notes, and the eighth note might be the same note as that bass note. This is a really common, it's just a common thing about how the guitar is played, where that you want to notate that bass note is intended to keep ringing while you keep playing the arpeggio. And so this is just a normal way to want to notate things. Therefore, we don't want to waste space every time this happens by showing both notes, even though in other situations where it doesn't happen quite so often, it is actually important to show the separate notes like this when they have, like, basically in cases like this measure here, where I have an eighth note and a quarter note, there's no possible conflict. We can tell this is an eighth note. It's a solid note head with a stem. But that case that we had going over there, like, it's the same case as this, it's actually a little slightly confusing if you've never seen it before, because you see what looks like a dotted half note, but it's beamed, and you're like, what is that? Well, if you're a guitar player, you don't go, what is that? You've seen it a million times. So basically, the story is that in most cases, we want to show, we don't want to make this dotted half note look like it's part of that beam. But in guitar music, it's okay, you want it. So we actually make two ways of making that happen. One is to select the eighth note and make it invisible, and I pressed V. And that causes it to kind of merge with the other one. You can also use the inspector to control whether something is visible or not. But there's another way we actually have of doing that, and that is if you explicitly, like I said, in this case, we go ahead and let these two note heads merge because they have the same type of note head. They're both that kind of solid note head. Well, if I do the same thing here, if I make them both have a half note type note head, then it'll work. So what I'm going to do is come over here to the inspector and let's see, is this right where my face is? Probably just about. Let me. You've seen my face long enough. So someone mentioned that last week that as I start using the inspector, it can be a little distracting because my face covers up some stuff. So anyhow, there I go. So under here, I think under head type, yes, I'm going to change it to the half note type. Boom. And then that also causes them to kind of merge together now that I've made them both explicitly be half note types. So anyhow, that will also let them merge. So that's a common thing they need to do in guitar music. By the way, I'm just going on and showing some things that I notice on this score. Anyone who has questions, I know there's a few people watching live because I see the stats on that. If anyone has any questions, feel free to be asking. Or just want to pop in and say hi, feel free. I could move my face to the left. Well, yeah, I could move the whole thing to the left, but then it would cover up part of the score. No matter where I put it, it covers something, and I feel like this bottom part of the inspector is something I don't use a lot, and that's why I ended up putting it there. It's possible, actually, the bottom left there is used less, but I don't know. I feel like I'm more likely to want to use some palette things over here. Anyhow, whatever. Some of the other things that are going on. So yeah, I picked this score because I saw some typical things in it that I figured I would talk through if people have questions or suggestions. So I'm not a guitar player myself. I don't write classical guitar music much, although I'm gonna make an attempt to take one of my pieces and adapt it for guitar here to talk about what's involved. So if other people have other insight, feel free to share. But there's just a couple of other things that I wanted to show about this score. One of them is the fingering. So guitar uses a couple different types of fingering. One are these numbers that indicate, well, which left-hand finger to use. In other words, these are left-hand fingers. They tell you on your fretting hand which finger to use to play this note. And so we have a way of entering those here. These are entered from the palette, so I'll enter this, and I have no idea, but I'm going to guess 2. I'm thinking like a pianist, and that probably isn't really reasonable, but that 2 is the wrong 2. That 2 was the piano 2, and that's why it's displayed the way it would in multi-voice piano music. This, it would normally be actually above the staff, but because there's multiple voices involved here, actually, I think just because of the multiple voices, and because the stem was forced down, normally that would be above. I'm going to make sure I use the guitar 2. See, this says left-hand guitar fingering, and there's where you're happy that my face is not covering up the palette. So left-hand guitar fingering 2. So I'll enter that. Now, if you're going to enter a lot of fingerings, you don't have to use the palette for this. Several releases ago, maybe at 3.1 maybe, or 3.2, we implemented fingering mode. So you can double-click that 2, and then just press space, and it moves to the next note, 3. 1, I'll press space, 2, 3. 1. Oh, and I get to enter a fingering on the other voice, too. Oh, I'll call that, since I have no idea, 4. I have absolutely no idea what I'm doing. Anyhow, I know how to enter the fingerings. I just don't know how to choose appropriate fingerings because I don't have any idea how this would be played. I'd have to sit down with a guitar and actually work out these notes, and even then, I'd probably not do it the way a real guitar player would. So anyhow, that's how you enter these fingerings. Those are the guitar left-hand fingerings. They are entered usually a lot, like you put a lot of these in scores. More sporadically, you might also put in right-hand fingerings. And these aren't indicated with numbers, but with letters: P, I, M, A, and C. Um, I would love to tell you that those are your 5 fingers, where P is your thumb and I is your index finger and M is your middle finger, but I actually have no idea how those translate. I would love it if someone would tell me that. But if you want to put in a right hand fingering, then P. Because I know there's a T here also. Oh, that's for left hand though. Left hand fingering T. I see. Thumb. So Y1 and T? I don't know. Maybe 1 is your index finger? Maybe so. 1 is index finger, I'll bet. On the left hand. Why do you need 5 fingers? I don't know. There you go. P, these are usually displayed kind of above the note, but you can always move these things. So I can easily move that 3 right onto the staff. There it goes, and move this guy onto the staff. So that's actually how this came up in a discussion recently, was about automatic placement and someone wanting it. Okay, I got it right. Good. Glad to know. Yeah, I'm sure those stand for the Italian names or something, probably Italian. So the discussion was, someone was like trying to turn off automatic placement to place these fingerings, but as you can see, it's not generally needed. It's only needed in, like, if I try to put this 3 here, it's going to add some extra space, which is probably good. You don't want that 3 colliding, but there might be, if you've got a really crowded score. And well, I won't show you this guy's score because he didn't say, yeah, feel free to share this, but he had a really, really densely packed score with tons of notes, all with fingerings, and they were all really, really, really well packed in there. And I could see why disabling automatic placement might have seemed like a good idea, although I still figure there's ways around it. But in any case, Spanish abbreviations. Okay, great. So much of music terms comes from Italian that I assume that, but it's true that a lot of guitar music specifically is coming from a Spanish tradition, so no surprise there that the abbreviations would be Spanish. And then also string numbers. You can, that's left hand fingering, right hand fingering, but you can also put in these string numbers here too. And so that's saying string number 2. And then there's also this thing where you see here, and to be honest, I'm not as familiar with how this works, but there's a thing where you basically you put a line over a whole phrase to say that it should be played either on a particular string, like that whole line should be played on one string, or that it's played at a certain fret position. I think there's different ways these lines are moved, are done. So here again, if you're a guitar writer who knows how to do that, who knows what these things mean and when you would use them, feel free to let me know. But I can tell you how to make that happen with MuseScore, at least. That's what I want to show. So if I want a line that has this, that says C4, I'm going to use, from the lines palette here, this guy here. And I just select my region and click that thing, and it puts that Roman numeral. You'll see he's used the Roman numerals here, except I think he added those just as plain text, it looks like. Yeah, he added those as plain text rather than using the line. But if you want the line for it, use the line, and then you can come over here in the inspector and change the text to be whatever you want. 3. And then also, for that matter, you can also make the line invisible. Check line visible, and now the line is actually invisible. Why would you do that rather than just add text? I don't know, for consistency. If you're going to use the line sometimes, if you're going to use the line ever, you might as well enter all these things as lines, and then that way, if you decide you want to change the font of them, you could say select all similar, and it will select all of those lines, and then you can fiddle with the font or whatever else. So, and notice these guys that were entered as plain text aren't selected. So that's an advantage to entering it as a line, even if you want to make the line invisible. So again, I did that by checking the line visible box here, but I'm going to reset it. There we go. Now it's visible again. So those are the things that happened in this score that are kind of guitar specific as far as the notation goes, as far as classical guitar. There's a ton more to it, but yeah, that's a good thing to know about. I'm going to show something now that's more from the jazz kind of end of things. And I'll just grab one of my scores, one of my scores. I'll grab a big band one. And we'll look at this guy and then look at the guitar part. So the guitar part for this, it's got some things written out. Don't really need to hear it. There's nothing much to hear. It's got some stuff written out. Oh yeah, there was a known bug in the beta version that's already been fixed for 3.5 is why the measure numbers are off here. I was momentarily distracted by that, and then I remembered, oh yeah, that's a bug already identified and fixed. So this is the beta version. The real 3.5 won't have this issue where the measure numbers are colliding with the bar lines here. So you see some stuff here is just notes, but I've got chord symbols and I've got rhythmic notation here. The rhythmic notation basically means you play that D flat chord and you just hold it for 7 beats like it says and then repeat it. So it's designed that you play that very specific rhythm. What happens if I do play this? Let's find out. So it played the chord symbol. When the MuseScore 3.5 plays chord symbols, as you have seen me demonstrate before. So that's not because I entered any special notes for this. You can do that, and I used to do that all the time. I would enter notes and hide them or put them on a separate staff for playback, but I will no longer be doing that. I will just be relying on MuseScore's playback. In this case, it didn't repeat it here because the MuseScore playback does not honor the rhythms that it sees. It just plays from the chord symbol. But I can fix that pretty quick. I'm going to select this chord, copy, and then select this note, paste, and then I can make this guy invisible because I don't really want to see it repeated. And now I think when it plays back, it's going to play back what I expect. Yeah, pretty cool. Haha, nice, I like. I'm going to undo all that stuff just because this is my real score and I don't want to mess it up. So the question is, how do I do that sort of stuff? Well, let me go to my little test score over here, and what you do is you enter your rhythm. Say I want a half note, and you can enter any old note you want. And in fact, what you can do is enter. This is what I would do when I was feeling up to it. Maybe enter a chord, and then bum, bum, bum. So let's make that be I'm entering my chord C and then using Shift E and Shift G, and I'll press the tie button to tie this over to a whole note because that's what I feel like. That's the rhythm I just sang. So if I write this and then select that stuff I just wrote and then come up here to Tools, Toggle Rhythmic / Notation. Boom. Now I have that same rhythm but written this way. This is the way a lot of jazz, pop, that type of thing where you're reading from chord symbols and you want to tell a guitar player a specific rhythm, or a pianist for that matter, a specific rhythm to play, but you don't want to tell them the specific notes either because you can't be bothered to think about the exact notes to play. Because I know what notes are in a C chord, but what I just wrote there, that C, E, and G in that octave, that might not actually be playable. Once you actually work out, well, in order to play that E, I would have to play that E on this, like that G, the top note there, the G would have to be the 3rd fret of the 3rd string, the 3rd fret of the 6th string, I guess, the highest string of the guitar. And then that means that E couldn't be played on that same E string. That E would have to be played on the B string. And then that C would have to be played on the G string. And in order to pull that, I'd have to think about, is that even playable? And maybe it is, but, often you might have something that actually isn't. So you write something that you think is going to sound okay, and then you just write a chord symbol and let the guitar player figure it out. That's my strategy for writing for guitar. I'm capable of figuring this stuff out, but it's a lot of brain power. So, I save that for the important stuff. So if I play this right now, it's not going to play those notes. See, it didn't play those notes. Why? Because by default, when you do this toggle rhythmic slash notation business, it actually turns off the playback because it assumes you're not going to go to the trouble of entering the real notes. You just enter some dummy notes, which is what I usually do. I just enter a C or whatever, and then it makes it this and silent. But I can select those notes, and because right now I've got a range selected, it's got rests and the ties and the bar lines, the inspector doesn't show me anything useful, so I press the notes button in the inspector, and now I can come here and I can make sure I turn on play. Now I think it's going to play that. I don't know if it's going to play the whole chord or just the one note, but we're going to find out in a second. So there you go. If you feel like entering the full notes, and because you want to put in a particular voicing, by all means do so, and then just make sure you turn play on after enabling the slash notation. Or what I could have done is left it the way it was, where, let's see, I just did Control Z, so now it's back to silent. But if I just add my C chord, and then make those two invisible. Oh, let me show you the other, because some of you have seen this before already, but it is now the case in MuseScore 3.5. If I want to select a range of chords, I can click one, shift click the next, and it selects all the chords in between there. So that's kind of cool. But I actually just want to select these two. So I have to be careful not to double click. There we go. Press V to make them invisible, and now I'll also get the playback I want. It didn't play this one short, so that was an advantage of having entered the notes and then just make them play, is I got to control the actual duration rather than having this C last all the way until that C. It didn't really honor the rest, but at least it got the rhythm right. Okay, so that's how you create that slash notation, and of course to enter those chords, I guess I didn't say that, but that's just Control K. K for chord. And that is because Control C, of course, is copy, and that's we can't change that. Every program in the world uses Control C for copy. So Control K for chord is what we ended up with for chord symbols. And you can type pretty much whatever you want. C major 9 sharp 11 parentheses no 5, and you'll get something. Ooh, did it? And it even played it. Yeah, it plays something. So you can enter pretty much anything you want as a chord symbol within reason, and we do our best to understand it, play it back, and display it reasonably, etc. The other thing you saw in the guitar part here was places where it's really not even a specific rhythm being notated, but just slashes to say, do your own thing. E flat minor, have a ball. To do that, you just select the measures you want to fill with slashes, and it doesn't even have to be full measures. Like if I want maybe two beats of that, and then I'm going to start having notes. So maybe from here to about there, I selected, and I want slashes just there. I go to Tools, Fill with Slashes. And now that's full of slashes. So, I don't know, those are some of the guitar-specific notation things that I knew to do, at least as far as standard notation goes. Now, see, the thing is, as soon as you start getting into tablature, that's a whole other can of worms. And I am going to talk a little bit about tablature in a minute. Oh yeah, there's other markings here, let ring, and you can add these things, and I'll just click a note and click the let ring symbol, and that adds that. Same with palm mute and all these other things. These are just symbols that guitar players might use, and you add them from the palette like any other symbol, really. But there's some very specific things that are used in tablature that I should talk about. But before I'll do that in conjunction with something that I want to talk about. I want to take this piece that I wrote that many of you have seen before, either because I've used it as a demo or because MuseScore used to use it as a demo, and I want to see what's involved in, like, if trying to make this for guitar. So So if I want that much music to be for guitar, it may or may not be playable. It's probably too dense. But I've been, sort of surprised, and a lot of guitar players will tell me that I will be surprised at how much music that's written for piano can be translated almost directly for guitar with little uh, very little changes needed. Now, I do know things like clustery stuff, like this cluster of three notes here. Yeah, that could, this cluster, yeah, between the B flat here and then the D and the F and the G, that's four notes all within the space of a sixth. That might be a challenge because, again, when you actually work out which string you need to be using to play each of these notes, you might discover, actually there's just no way to pull that off because it would require one finger to be, sort of removed from your hand to reach a fret further up than the others. But in any case, if I just wanted to get an idea of this, I'm going to show you how I'm going to do this. So what I'm going to do is I am going to create a new score, and I'm going to create it using the guitar plus tablature template. So guitar plus tablature template. And then I'll go ahead and make it in key of F like this is. And, I forgot to tell it that I needed a pickup, but that's okay. I will enter a couple notes. I'll enter a few rests, actually. Boom, 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 boom. And select two of them and delete. And now I've got my pickup there. So now what I'm going to do is select these first four measures plus the pickup and copy it into my score. But actually, if you notice, my score, of course, had two staves here. I'm going to go ahead and add another staff. So add staff. And so now I have two treble clef staves and then my tablature staff. And I'm now going to paste my music in. Okay. And what you can see already is that the tablature staff has already been populated with all the notes, because it uses what's called linked staves. Anything in this top staff here is automatically reflected here. In fact, if I change this F here is that E string on first fret. So if you don't know how to read tablature, that's fine. I'm not going to tell you all the ins and outs of it, but these 6 lines correspond to the 6 strings of the guitar. E string, low E, A, D, G, B. This is the high E string, and this is telling you to put your finger on the first fret. So it's a way of not having to read music. It just tells you which finger to put on which fret of which string, and it's something that people associate with rock guitar and is sometimes looked down upon. Oh, you can't read music, you just read tablature. But this stuff has been around for centuries. This is how Renaissance lute music was written, and actually the tablature feature was written by a Renaissance lute specialist in MuseScore. So it just so happens that it also works for rock guitar. So anyhow, I've got this F here. If I change this F to E, you'll see that, look, now it's 0 because now it's an open string, E. And if I move it even lower to E flat, you can't play E flat on the E string. And it automatically moved it down to the next string down and says, 4th fret on the B string will give you that note. So it's smart about such things. So what I'm going to do is set it back the way it all was. And then I want to get this stuff onto that top staff also, so it can be in on the fun, because this linked staff business only works if everything's all on one staff. So what I can do is select this whole range, and then I'm going to use Tools, Implode. Boom. Now everything is all there on the top staff. And if I look at this now is when I get to decide, well, how playable is any of this? And the answer is, unfortunately, apparently not very. I don't know. Guitar, if there's any actual guitar players here, you'd have to tell me if, right off the bat, if this first chord is playable. That's saying to play the E string on the 5th fret, the B string on the 8th fret, and this guy here, D string, on the 3rd fret. That feels like a stretch. Is that too much of a stretch? I don't know. Put a guitar in my hand and I might be able to tell you. But I will tell you that if this one is playable, there's a good chance that this one is not. Because having to get one finger on that 1st fret and another finger on the 8th fret at the same time is just very likely not possible. So this might not be playable as is. But it doesn't make me give up on this. It makes me wonder, well, what if I changed the key of it or just said something really trivial like that? So I'm going to start moving this thing down and just see what happens. Oh, look at that. In this key here, 6 to 4, all these intervals suddenly, I still have this crazy, yeah, this is going to be the bitch. This is going to be the one that really can't be played. I'll probably have to thin out this texture to make it playable. But boy, it's starting to look more playable to me. All these numbers are all closer to being in the same ballpark. We keep going down and just see. Look at this one. Is that any better? Here I had to go from 1 to 6, and that's my biggest stretch, 1 to 6. That's a distance of 5 frets. And I'm thinking like a logical person, and I imagine this actually applies on guitar. Maybe it doesn't. 0 to 5 is the same amount of stretch. Let me just go down one. Oh my gosh, look at that. I go down one more key, and suddenly this first chord only has a stretch of 3. I don't have any stretches of as big as 5 anymore. And even this crazy one here starts to look a little less crazy. Except now I've got a note that's a little too low. It's marked in red. It's like, okay, well, you've gone past the lower bounds of this thing. I'm going to go down one more step just to see if that makes it any better in any other. Oh my God, look at that. This whole thing became totally playable, this chord. Oh, but this chord here, 0 to 7. So, okay, I'm going to go back where I was. Oh, but that's that same one here, 1 to the thing. So I think if I use this key here, and at this point I don't even remember what key I'm in. I've just been moving things down. Ooh, that sounds. Oh, that's because it's still playing the old second staff. Let me get rid of that second staff. I don't need it anymore. Let's see. Yeah, so there's lots of things that I can do. I'm starting with the real basics here of, well, what if I just change the key of the thing? Because sometimes you do that. Just by changing the key, oh my gosh, I have such an easier to play thing. And really, I have one note that's down, what is that note? It's, unfortunately, another bug that was in the 3.5 beta that is already fixed is, after you've done a certain type of edit, the what do you call it here? The status bar gets locked, and now it's just going to keep telling me rest. No matter what I select, it's going to keep saying rest, which is really a drag. And so that's a bug that's already fixed. But that's how I would find out what note that is. But I can move it up an octave. Oh, it's a D. Okay, so I'm at a D. Well, I'm just going to move that note up an octave, and now suddenly I can fix that. So that's one thing I can do. So the only thing that's to me possibly not playable is this. And here is where now I think that the people are making suggestions. You can use alternate string and fret to play treble notes. So certainly MuseScore is picking for me what it thinks is the way to do things. But for instance, maybe playing these notes here. In this case, I probably don't have a choice, but there are choices in other places. Like, for instance, this note here, say. I'm looking for a good candidate, but it doesn't really matter. This note here, it's the 3rd fret of the D string. Well, if I press Control down, it shows me, it'll move it to the next string and tell me that that same note could have been played with the 8th fret on the A string. And, maybe that ends up being an easier way of doing things. Now, I don't think that's going to help me here because playing this thing on the 12th fret here isn't going to be any better than what it did. And there's no room. All these notes are full. So I can't really I can't really fix this, except I could say, you know what, maybe I don't need this note. Maybe this note here was, it was all well and good on the piano, but maybe that eighth note there I don't need. And then maybe now I can move this note here from the seventh. I can move this note from the seventh fret up a string and move this note also up a string. And now I've got something that maybe that's a little more playable. Well, definitely a lot more playable. I just had to get rid of one note to do it. So that's all. Oh, gosh, that is a brilliant observation. Thank you so much. I actually didn't have to do that. Why? Because let me undo all that. This is unfretted. That's not. I don't need a finger to play the zero. Thank you. So there's a big difference between the difference between 1 and 8. If I have to stretch from first fret to eighth fret, that's a stretch of 7 frets. That's a big stretch. Stretching from 0 to 7 is no stretch at all because I don't need a finger to play 0. Oh, brilliant. Love it, love it, love it. So thank you. So actually this is completely playable. Now I still have to ask myself if I like it in this key as much. And I still, like I said, I don't actually remember what key I'm in because all I did was move the pitch down. But let's see, it starts on basically scale degree 5, C. So in my new key, my first note is G. So this is telling me it's really the key of C. So I'm just going to go ahead and change the key signature to say C. So that, so I'll select a measure, click my C major key signature, and now it's in C. And so now it's a little more, now as I read the notes, it's a little more clear what's going on. So this is, in principle, playable by a guitar player. It's still the case that once I get down to this little glob of notes here, this is requiring all 5 fingers to be used, including the thumb. So maybe, and this one isn't, right? Because this is, one of them is a 0, so that's great. So this only requires 4 fingers. 4 fingers is better because using your thumb of your left hand is a little like maybe less common of a thing. It's a thing. But this chord here may or may not be a great choice on guitar, and that if I just eliminated one note from the thing, and then I have to think about how that went, but I'm looking at these 2 notes, and hit bottom and bottom. I remembered what this was like originally, and those are like really important moving lines, so I probably don't want to get rid of those. But this note here, I might be able to safely just say bye-bye to and not miss it. Yeah, I didn't really miss it so much. It's kind of too low. No doubt, it is kind of too low at this point. The whole thing is, I mean, and so I'd have to think about that. But this was a piece of, when I wrote it, I didn't give a single moment's thought to playability on guitar. I wrote it on the piano. The point is, if you give even the slightest thought to playability on guitar, you can write a lot of stuff and it works. And using the tablature feature built into MuseScore, that ability to have your music kind of automatically reflected in tablature, and then play around with things like changing the key or moving notes from string to string, or just thinning out the texture here and here, or changing the octave of a single note like I did for one of those notes in one of those versions I had. These are all things you can do to sort of get yourself into playable territory. So whenever you basically see all the notes being either low single digits like this, or even if they're high notes, if high numbers, like these could all be double digit numbers, 10s, 11s, 12s, and 13s, as long as they're all that way, because that just tells you your whole hand shifts up the fretboard, and now you're playing higher up on the fretboard. But as long as the distance between like the biggest stretch you have to make from the lowest fret to the highest fret is not too great at any one time, there's a chance of it being playable. When I say a chance, well, realistically, you want to sit down with an actual guitar and really physically try to do this. You don't have to literally be able to play the guitar. I could just sit down with the guitar right now and slowly, painstakingly, it might take me over a minute to play this one measure, but by gosh, I can put a finger on the third fret of the A string, the third fret of the B string, and play that E and go strum, and then I can play that string open, and then I can look at, I can just look at each one of these combinations one by one. So why does the G clef have an 8 below it? When the default template for guitar in MuseScore uses what's called the octave clef, because guitar always sounds an octave lower than written. Like the low E string on guitar is written this note right here. It's written to be, that's curious. Why is that showing up in red? Don't know. Because of the voice. Because red, the reason I was wondering is red we also use to say this note's not playable by this instrument. So anyhow, this low E, because this is voice 4, this low E is written to be just below middle C, but it actually sounds an octave below that. Some publishers writing for guitar choose to just say, well, I'm just still going to write it in treble clef and assume everyone knows it sounds an octave below. Other publishers use an explicit 8 on the clef to indicate, hey, this is going to sound an octave lower than written. They're both valid ways of doing things. So the default template for MuseScore does it that way. If you want to do it the other way, you can certainly change this to the standard treble clef. I'll change that to standard treble clef here. But as you see, now it's going to say, hey, those notes really are lower. So then what you would need to do is go into the staff properties and tell it, oh, no, guitar sounds 1 octave. I think I so seldom mess with the transposition settings, but I think this is how I'm going to do it. I say it sounds an octave down, I think is the deal. Let me press apply and find out if that's the right direction. If it's the wrong direction, then I will just fix it right away. Let's see, apply, boom, that did the right thing. So now it knows the guitar sounds an octave lower than written, so you can write it on regular treble clef. If you go to the instruments list, also you can add a guitar. Let's see, under here, well, let me just type guitar into the search box. Guitar treble clef right there, guitar treble clef. So in the instruments list, you can add a guitar instrument that's already set up that way with regular treble clef and set up to transpose. So you can set it up that way. But the default uses the 8 because, I don't know, some plurality of publishers at the time we were doing this looked like they were doing things that way, I think mostly in Europe. That's a lot of stuff I just really whipped through. This is sort of just a kind of an overview of a ton of things involved in writing for guitar. And I don't know if people have questions. Feel free to shoot them this way. I feel like I packed an awful lot of information in here, some of which is like really obvious to people who've been doing this a while. Probably some amount of it is new to probably most people seeing this will have seen something they haven't seen before. At least that is my hope. And there's plenty of things also. Oh, there's one other thing I definitely have to show while I'm showing tablature. A common thing is like this little figure here. Realistically, it's conceivable at least a guitar player would not play that figure by literally playing it as 5 separate notes. It's conceivable that he'd play it as a single note and then bend the string. In this style of music, for this type of piece, no, probably not really. But it is a thing, right? And so I do want to show you that because it is kind of cool. Where is it? It's under articulations, I want to say. See, I rearranged my palette, so now I don't know how to find anything anymore on the standard palette that I just switched to. But I'm going to add this bend here. And now, here in the inspector, I can control the shape of that bend. If I did that right, I love it. I love it. Okay, I got to rewrite the piece to do that now. That is so cool. Um, Anyhow, that's the thing. So, yeah, is this a readable notation? Maybe not for that thing, but it is accurate for what it's worth. But yeah, that's you wouldn't really go that far. It's usually just a little thing. But then that is a thing. Okay, so Variable will play the chord symbols now. Will it honor alternative? No. So this is currently the chord symbols. The chord symbols when they play back. I will show you using my little test score that I had going over here. Um, I'll enter a new chord here. Actually, let me just enter from the fret thing here. Eventually, yes, it clearly would make sense. So this is why I don't use drag and drop. It's hard to get that thing to line up. There we go. But drag and drop is nice when I'm demonstrating. So this fret diagram is not paid attention to when it plays back that C. It just plays back using what it thinks of as a reasonable C voicing that's very not specific to any instrument. Now, in the inspector over here, we have a style of playback here. So first of all, there's interpretation, jazz versus literal. In the jazz interpretation, it might add sixths and ninths. Well, it didn't in this case, but it looks at the context and might add things. I think it's not as likely to do so for triads. It's more likely for seventh chords. Here under voicing, though, you'll see a bunch of options here, one of which is drop two. Drop two tends to mimic more or less how a guitar would do things, but it's not necessarily specifically copying this fretboard diagram. Yeah, someday we'll make it so that if there's a fretboard diagram there, it'll just take that voicing directly. Absolutely, that would make sense. But I can actually take this thing and I can right-click it and say realize chord symbols. Okay. Oh crap, 3.5 also had a bug where realize chord symbols crashes if there's a fretboard diagram. That bug is fixed. But sorry about that. I love it when things crash in the demo, but that is a known, already fixed crash. The playback, yeah, the realized chord symbols of a chord symbol with a that has a fretboard diagram crashed in the beta. So let's see. I'll restore my session. Yes, and this time I won't ask it to realize that C chord, but a different C chord. I don't care. And okay, so go back to my little test score over there and enter a plain C chord. And I think also there might have been a bug if it was the last chord. I think I was only in the alpha, where like the last chord of the score would crash when you tried to do realized chord symbols. So let's try this again. Oh, except, okay, so this time you just get a plain simple triad plus a bass note. If I change that guy then to drop 2, and now do a realized chord symbols. The spacing here, now drop 2 basically says take that second top note E, drop it down an octave. Well, as it happens, that is more or less kind of sort of how a lot of guitar voicings are constructed. They are essentially drop 2 voicings. In this case, it's not the same as this, I know, because that C voicing here has an open top E string, so it really should have had an E. Actually, though, as far as the octave goes, that yeah, that E would have really been here. Anyhow, it's not the same, but it sounds a little more like how a guitar player might have played a C chord. It's just not the exact C chord. And by the way, the default sound for this is going to be piano always, because it's in the beta, it's whatever the sound of the staff is. So if you're writing a flute, if you've got a flute staff and you put a chord symbol on it, you're going to hear a choir of flutes playing that chord. And people didn't like that. So we now have the default playback always piano. But all you got to do is go to the mixer, view, mixer, and expand that channel strip, and you'll have the harmony channel here that I can select the harmony channel and change it to guitar. I type G and I get the guitar stuff here, and I'm looking for an appropriate guitar. I guess I'll use the jazz guitar. And now it plays back with a guitar sound. So there you have it. That's a whole ton of stuff about guitar. And I'm not a guitar player again, and I don't write a lot for guitar other than in a jazz context where I'm mostly doing, like you saw in my arrange feature at the beginning. And so at the beginning, it's all just guitar playing single note melody, and the guitar and the piano has all the chord stuff. But there's places where I do at least. This is a transcription of Bill Evans' piece called My Bells. That someone else transcribed, and then I adapted to be for piano and guitar and bass. So this was originally all piano, all these notes here, Bill just big giant hand thing going on here. But I managed to just sort of partition the notes out to make it, oh, I'm done. Oh, okay. I guess I accidentally got off, and hopefully I'm back. So anyhow, so you can see that every once in a while, where necessary, because I had this big, thick texture in the original Bill Evans version. If you missed it, basically this is my adaptation of a Bill Evans thing that was kind of a solo piano thing that was eventually scored for orchestra, but he clearly worked it out as a solo piano thing because there's places where he plays that on the arrangement. And then I just took that and adapted it for guitar plus piano plus bass. And there were places where, in order to get all the notes that Bill played and make it be playable, like I didn't want the pianist to have to work as hard as Bill did. Colleen, if you're watching, you're welcome. So I didn't want the pianist to have to work as hard as Bill Evans did. So I gave the melody to the guitar, but where possible, I also gave the guitar additional notes to thin the texture, so the pianist didn't have to be doing as much while all the eighth notes were happening. So yeah, that's a place where I did make at least some, a little more intense writing for guitar. But mostly I either write single line things for guitar or chord symbols. And yeah, from working on MuseScore and helping people on the forums, I've learned a lot about how to do things for guitar. So I hope you've all found this useful. I can tell you that within the next hours, days, we're going to release this release candidate for 3.5, for MuseScore 3.5. So either next week or the week after, I would expect me to have an actual release of 3.5 ready to just talk about some more. And other than that, I will, as always, take your suggestions for what topics you'd like to hear me talk about. I'm always happy to talk about what people want to hear me talk about. So with that said, I will take my leave and hope everyone has a good week, and see you next time. Bye.